workshop, we're focusing on 3 questions. The first one is, what is the knowledge building pedagogical approach? The second one is, why is it important to use this approach in teaching and learning? And the third question we are going to tackle in this workshop is how to actually do knowledge building in your classroom. Now, we are going to tackle these questions one by one, and a member of our group will introduce the question with 5 minutes talk, okay? And then we will spend 10 minutes as a whole group to ask questions, to contribute ideas. Then after that, we'll move to the second question, and then to the last question. And then we'll leave about 10 minutes at the end of that to have an overall discussion. Is that okay with you? Okay, so we'll start with the first question. Mark, you want to begin? You have 5 minutes.
Okay, so Wing, I thought you were going to quickly run through the principles first, but
no,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. So, already not getting it right. So essentially, for knowledge building is essentially it's a way to explicitly support learners to work collaboratively to improve ideas that can then be of value in the community. And that's the real simple version. My interest in knowledge building is that if students are doing knowledge building in their classrooms, then they are absolutely giving life to all of the competencies and capabilities that are aimed for in our New Zealand curriculum. Additionally, the connectedness and the relationship building that is typical of a culturally responsive and relational classroom, a high trust learning environment, are also necessary for knowledge building to take place. So the biggest shift for learners in New Zealand, and that most of us have experienced in our classrooms, is that shift from my teacher doing the learning for me in terms of helping me find ideas and question those ideas and produce some kind of learning artifact around knowledge that already exists in the world, to actually learning to ask the bigger and better questions themselves, to work with other class members, to improve, to find answers, to reference authoritative sources, to help develop answers, to theorize and challenge each other's thinking so that ultimately they can come up with better and better ideas, and that those things that they decide to focus on are things which can actually be of use to them as a learning community and potentially to community beyond the classroom. So for all of those reasons, as New Zealand teachers, you'll be able to see the way in which that then means knowledge building is giving life to learners who are connecting across their curriculum, learners who are connecting to each other, who are improving ideas, doing work with ideas, and therefore developing the capabilities to solve complex problems, to bring in thinking and ideas and theorize from a range of contexts that are of value or importance to them. So if you've read the abstract, which is available, I don't want to just sort of go through all that in detail, but for example, many schools we're grappling with innovating our curriculum, trying to break down subject silos, trying to inspire inquiry and project-based approaches to learning that engage students in collaborative and cooperative practices that make that happen. And if students are knowledge building, they will be doing all of those things together. But what we've also learned is that it only happens in environments where the relationships have been well developed, where there's a lot of trust between all of the learners in the classroom, and that includes the teacher in the classroom. So concepts like manaakitanga, whanaungatanga, the reciprocal relationships that happen are central to knowledge building if it's to be effective. And that's...
You have time now to ask.
For 5 minutes?
Yeah. Well, basically, knowledge building is a pedagogical model and approach developed by two researchers at the University of Toronto about 30 years ago. And they distinguish the difference between learning and knowledge building. They are saying that learning is more or less like an internal concept of ideas, whereas knowledge building is externalizing the ideas. Like if students, they work together and then they develop ideas and then they put the ideas out as an object. And then as an object that everyone in the community can actually improve the idea and then develop new knowledge. And they also believe that knowledge can be created by even very young students, like even primary students are able to create new knowledge, which is useful to their own community. Now, that is the basic idea. We need to actually distinguish between learning and knowledge building. But learning obviously is a byproduct. When you develop knowledge, obviously you will learn at the same time. So there's no tension between that, but the focus is on knowledge itself. And in order to produce knowledge, it is not an individual process, it's a collective process. So knowledge building is very much a community-based concept. So we work together, by discussing, by experimenting together, we create new knowledge, which will be useful to the community. And they have developed 12 principles. I'm not going to go into the principles. Those are pedagogical principles, including assessment principles, including like idea how to improve ideas. But the focus is on the learner as an agent, but not as the learning agent, but as an epistemic agent, an agent which can create knowledge. Now that is if you conceptualize this as a triangle, the learner, the agent is in the center of the triangle. But the learner is not working by himself or herself, but with other people in the community. Now, this is not just talking about students, we are also talking about teachers. So this model can be used as a knowledge building model for teachers as well. Our group in the last 18 months has been functioning as a knowledge building community. We actually have created new knowledge ourselves. Now, if you read our documents, read our abstracts, read our articles, you'll find that we've been doing it as a community. That's my brief thing. I have used up like 5 minutes already over time. Any questions about what is this approach that you have in mind, or any ideas you want to contribute to this discussion? You are most welcome.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes, of course. I'm not going to answer your question. The whole group will answer your question.
It's just really a joke because I come to this from a fairly kind of uninformed stance, but this sounds to me to make great sense. You say that that it is in fact intergenerational. So we're looking at the little children right up to the sort of tertiary level here in terms of creating useful knowledge. Yes. Can I ask if there are hierarchies of what is deemed to be useful knowledge within knowledge building, or is that sort of open to
useful knowledge
community
useful to
discussion?
The communities?
Yeah, what do we mean by useful knowledge? Is that determined, or is that open?
It has to be determined by the community itself.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah. We can't actually say this is useful to you or not.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly. Okay,
so
it's actually bespoke. It's targeted, isn't it?
Yeah, it is not a body of knowledge that will be imposed to a community. We're not talking about a knowledge, imposing knowledge. We are talking about creating knowledge. Of course, when you create knowledge, you need to know what knowledge has already been created. Obviously, right?
Yes.
So it's like in those 12 principles, there's one principle is you need to actually use knowledge which has been created, right? And you build on knowledge. Okay. Any other ideas or questions? Or Darren, you want to say, Ken, you want to say anything?
Can I just something I wanted to highlight there in terms of what's useful knowledge, and in terms of knowledge building, it's a community process. So there's something called promisingness that's a word or promising idea. So the community itself, for those engaging in it, will identify the ideas that are worth pursuing. You know, that's any idea that's put out there is fine. It's the concept of knowledge building. It doesn't matter what, but then the community itself starts defining the lines of inquiry, what ideas will be developed. So in a way, it's sort of an emergent thing that the community work on. There's nothing defined beforehand.
One of the interesting things about that is that you need to establish that strong community foundation for effective knowledge building to happen. But in the process of doing the knowledge building work, and some of the research identifies that when the students are actually negotiating and debating what are the promising ideas, all of those things serve to strengthen that community too. So it's even the process in that is reciprocal in terms of strengthening community, but also building community so that work can happen.
Yeah.
Any other questions? We only have 1 minute left at the most for this part.
I'll ask a question. Sorry.
I was going to ask about the structure, that's the scaffolds that sort of support, you know, the contribution from, you know, wide contribution across the community. And
they use a software called Knowledge Forum, which is a networking software and specifically designed with scaffolds there for students to actually use to scaffold them to produce ideas and discussion as well. Now, this is the online side, but if you are in an inside class, like a face-to-face class, they also have all those knowledge building talks that they have suggested how you do it, like knowledge building circles. You post things on a knowledge building wall or a note, that sort of thing. So there are procedures, but you have to be careful. Knowledge building is not structured. So they don't actually have a set of procedures that you have to follow. In many pedagogical models, they have all these very strict structures, but knowledge building is not, because knowledge building is about creating ideas, creativity, innovation. You can't actually provide a very strict structure, or else you will actually suppress innovation in a sense. But even that, because they have principles, the challenge of doing knowledge building in the class is how to translate all these principles into actions. That is very context-based. That's why we need to actually produce ideas which will be useful in a New Zealand classroom. Even though knowledge building has been used in many countries in the world, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Europe, Toronto, Quebec, many countries, successful. Yet, of course, we can learn from them. We have to produce our own thing here in New Zealand. That is why we are very keen to have a group of teachers working together as a community to produce ideas, practices, which can be used here in New Zealand. That's our whole idea. We got to stop here. Darren, you have to move on to discuss with the group why it is important to use knowledge building approach for teaching and learning. Darren. Yeah, Darren? There is Darren.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm here. So I'm supposed to be experienced with this, and I'm still talking, and it's on mute. But anyway, yeah, I had a slideshow in the background I've created, but I like, in a way, I quite like messy stuff and unstructured stuff and just talking about things. So do feel free just to throw stuff, and it might be useful at some point as well to show you what knowledge building looks like. Bearing in mind this is an hour, so it's really just a taster, although some of you have experience in it. So I got a slideshow that I will share later, because I like working with pictures, but I'm just going to ignore that because it feels a wee bit formal and just sort of moves away from conversation. But I think essentially the idea is this is about pulling out what the research says about this, because there's lots of things we can sort of deduce ourselves when we look at the New Zealand curriculum, why we want to do things, etc. But when you look at the research, there's some few articles around that actually delve into the whys of knowledge building quite a bit of depth. And they do it really, really well. Sometimes they do the research quite poorly, but they do the background stuff quite well. Some of the things that are picked up, well, one key area, Marlene Scardi-Malia, who's one of the key people that Wing mentioned before, talks about dealing with complexity. And that's a key part of knowledge building and why you engage with it, because we have a tendency in education perhaps to steer kids away from complexity, to make it simple for them. As teachers, we feel like we need to try and simplify all the time for them. In fact, knowledge building is an environment for students to learn to deal with complexity. In fact, what Marlene Scudamale says is it's about enjoying complexity. So it's not something to be avoided. And in fact, the complexity is a part of our society and a part of our future. So it's very, very important that kids and adults experience this. And knowledge building for me is such a perfect way of dealing with that. There are other ways, of course, but in terms of complexity itself, and the research often talks about things like wicked problems, which you've talked about. You would come across this concept that, and I don't like having a dystopian view of our future. I like to be quite positive about our future, and I have read Kerry Face's Learning Futures book, which I thoroughly recommend. She talks about changing this message that the future is something that will happen to us, and she talks about it's something we shape and we have ownership of. And I think that's really important message to take in here, that there are wicked problems, there are sort of societal, global issues to deal with, but we've had problems throughout the centuries. We've probably got the capacity now, a capacity we've never had before in terms of dealing with these sorts of problems. And so that's one, in terms of looking at the issues and developing within people the ability to deal with these problems, to look at solutions, to interrogate them. And the other sort of thing that comes out is that it sort of reflects how we work currently. So if you look at the modern world, it's full of complexity, but also in terms of how we work, whether it's within society, world of work, is increasingly collaborative, community-based, increasingly dealing with complexity. I don't know if you probably don't know, but the knowledge building, it comes from the sciences, really. Its origins are within the sciences. There's some irony in that, in a way, when I look at how science is taught in many schools. Sorry if there's any science teachers. Chris is a former science teacher, so he would have plenty to say on this. But the sciences, when you actually work in the sciences, it's not this vision of this thing where we're working in isolation. It's a highly collaborative environment, and scientists themselves have huge accountability to their community. They will often have their work interrogated. So it's something where the way they work is not often what we see within the education system, especially within science classes, etc. But if we take that out of science, you live in the world of technology industry. Now I'm looking at work specifically here, but the technology industry is highly complex and it's highly collaborative. And the way they work, they build with ideas, they do design thinking, etc. Again, this sort of stuff, it's highly important that kids experience this in education. And it's not just about work, it's in terms about society. So in terms of that background, it's really important that kids experience this within school. And for me, knowledge building, the research we go through in knowledge building does this better than anything I've come across so far. And it's highly, highly challenging to engage in it, and it's going to be very challenging for the kids, but that doesn't mean we steer clear of it. And it does it so well because it basically it's promoting principles and ways of doing things which reinforce this complexity that we work, etc. So, for example, knowledge building is an open-ended, exploratory process. So, once again, it reinforces the things we need kids to work with. It's inquiry-based. It deals with curiosity. It deals with being able to work with ideas and develop them. It's this whole messy environment that has strong learner agency, where you have total ownership of what's going on. The teacher doesn't direct knowledge building, doesn't direct the lines of inquiry. The students or whoever's engaging with it, maybe teachers who are working as a community practice, they direct where things are going. So what you see in knowledge building, these inquiry that go off where ideas are being continually developed, and that's where real knowledge building happens, rather than just knowledge sharing. We've talked about quite a bit. So for me, it's a no-brainer. I see so many new initiatives, and the whole concept of innovation has been interrogated recently on social media. I found quite interesting. And knowledge building has been around 30 years, or longer than that. However, we have a whole number of initiatives within New Zealand that are being picked on, whatever they may be, but for whatever reasons, knowledge building hasn't. And I think for me, that's a travesty. And I think it's something that has so much worth for our kids currently and moving forward that we have to engage in it. So for us here, it's probably what we're doing because we want to actually get the idea. That's pretty much it, Wayne.
Yeah, you use up your 5 minutes, more than that.
Sure,
We have like 10 minutes at the most to raise questions. Yeah, ideas you want to contribute? Yeah.
I've got a question. So I really agree that this is, you know, it really focuses on the learning, teaching, and potentially assessment nexus. So it's developing professional learning communities, and the evidence is saying from OECD and Charles Fidel, etc., that is the heart of innovation. That's where it's going to change the culture of day-to-day classrooms and what's happening day-to-day, hour to hour. And I think so. What is your capacity? Like I looked at NET NZ, and it looks like a reforming of the old VLN, because I was involved with that with Coronet, you know, and Coromandel, with the video conferencing and whatnot. So now we're looking at a 2019 model you've got here. Like, is it capacity? How big can it hold? You know, how many teachers and classes and whatnot could it actually hold? Because it could. This is a platform for professional collaboration with students and teachers. So it's got massive potential.
Ian, come on, you just can't. You're jumping at a bit to answer that, I'm sure. Although it sort of goes beyond NET. But you want to say anything, Kim?
I just sort of wondered how big the capacity, you know, your capacity on holding the, you know, like.
I'm actually, I like Philippa could probably comment on the sort of limitations when you got a small group, but I'm really interested in the concept of scale. Like I was going to talk about Manuel Castell's Network Society, which is written about 20 years ago. Which is worth look, even if you don't read the books, they're pretty weighty. But if you do a bit of a Google search, you'll find some interesting stuff. It talks about the society, so it's the impact of the internet and technology in society, how we form networks, how we, and we've got this whole emergent environment now where potential scale in terms of connections and collaboration is it's like nothing we've had before. That of course brings challenges as well, but I'm quite interested in exploring what could this look like. Imagine kids across different schools collaborating, doing knowledge building, but it's at scale. That would be quite interesting. I haven't seen it yet, but it's something that I'm curious.
Actually, Darren, this question I will actually leave at the end for you to talk about the future, right? Because we need to actually think about the future. We can't just think about one seminar or one workshop. The capacity thing, we've been thinking for many years, how we can actually engage more teachers in doing this. Obviously, NET NZ can be a leader in this country in doing it as an organization. Or NEX that we're doing right now. But I will let Darren to talk about it at the end. So are there any other questions? If no, then Philippa, can you move on to how
All right, so I got tasked with talking about the how. I do have a presentation that I'd like to share. It's got lots of visual bits in it, so I just need to figure out how to screen share. Okay. So hopefully can you see my presentation on your screens now? Yes? Yeah. Alrighty, so I've kind of pulled out little bits from research and bits from my own experience as a teacher trying to develop a knowledge building community. So it's quite complex, there's lots of aspects to it, so I'll try to whiz through as quickly as I can. So as some of the others have mentioned, developing communities really important. Developing trust among community members and developing a sense of community is a huge part of this, particularly the online context where you've got students who may not know each other at all, be in completely different environments. I think this is a really important thing to put on initially. We're asking a lot of their students. They might be stepping outside of their entire experience of what education is, and we're asking them to put their ideas out there to the community, so they're taking a bit of risk. So I think it's quite vital actually to develop a safe culture for idea development. So that's something that I put a lot of energy into at the start of the year with my art history classes. Spent a few weeks just building connections and working on sharing ideas and becoming accustomed to putting thoughts out there. It's also a lot about learning to speak a new language for learning. So from individual learning to a communal thing where ideas are at the centre and really visible. And it's a new learning dynamic. So in knowledge building communities, there's sharing of power. The teacher's the facilitator, sometimes the participant. So in knowledge building communities, the principle of idea diversity ensures that diverse learners have the right to equitable roles within knowledge building. So it's a move away from that traditional dynamic in the classroom. All ideas are improvable. It's central to knowledge building, and this also enshrines equity and democracy. All participants are valued, contributors to idea creation, and the cultures and understandings of all of our comma have something to bring to the process. Now, developing a collaborative community, that's quite a challenge, I think, in the New Zealand education system with the way that we're used to packaging learning. So this requires quite a careful and deliberate fostering, I think, from teachers. It's really hard to develop deep inquiry when we're applying knowledge building over standard learning practices. So there's a whole lot of cultural norms that need to be developed. Part of that is actually modelling to our students how to inquire. I think sometimes we assume as teachers that our students know how to do this. However, after what might be a decade in education that focuses on the individual, this takes very deliberate actions and modelling to foster these skills. A lot of the research agrees that scaffolding towards collaborative activities is an important part of preparing students for knowledge building. Particularly when knowledge building is significantly divergent from the existing school and classroom cultures. So that takes a lot of scaffolding and supporting students to get to that stage. It's really important also that, that there's a clear model of inquiry. So in Lee Chan and Van Elf's study, they talk about teachers giving students really clear guidelines about how to contribute. Similarly, Felix and our frame knowledge building is an epistemic game, and they talk about the use of thinking cards to guide knowledge building moves. So I've started thinking, what could that look like in our context, and working on creating like a kind of New Zealand kind of version of that. Another thing that's really, really important is understanding the principles. So it's quite important that teachers have a really strong understanding of the principles, and the students have strong understanding of principles. But it's important that that the principles are broken down and made accessible to students. So time needs to be invested in de-jargoning the principles and developing language that's contextually appropriate and will make sense to students. So understanding the principles really deeply is important as a scaffold for reflecting and developing further and deeper knowledge building. So I kind of drew on an example that was talked about in Lee Chan and Van Elst's study, where they took the principles and they broke them down into 5 core principles that would make sense to the context. So I've tried to, working with Marg, I've tried to break that down into what knowledge building could look like in the New Zealand context. So looking at concepts like ako and tino rangatiratanga, so owning the learning, and so ako and knowledge building supports reciprocal, collective and ongoing sense making, where power is shared and learners have the right to equity and self-determination as they work together to create new and improved ideas. Concepts like manaakitanga and whanaungatanga. So working as a learning whānau, so knowledge building, manaakitanga and whanaungatanga represent learning environments where high levels of trust are built, which underpin relationships of care and connectedness, and where respectful and inclusive behaviours are valued. And wānanga, evidence-based learning and inquiry. So in knowledge building, the concept of wānanga embeds learning practices which are responsive to relevant evidence about ideas, knowledge and akonga, where learners reference expert information and opinions, they're demonstrating wānanga. And another aspect that's really important to the how of knowledge building is how we deal with assessment. So an assessment for learning approach fits well with knowledge building, the knowledge building pedagogical approach. There's a real emphasis on this across the research on metacognitive practices and reflecting on the knowledge building. How are we going? What kind of knowledge building are we doing? So within knowledge building, students play an important part in the assessment of their learning, cognitively reflecting on their progress and how they're working as a knowledge building group and setting new goals for their learning. So a portfolio approach is recommended for pulling together students' ideas and giving them metacognitive tools. So in a New Zealand context, where assessment rules for the subject allow them to, students should seek to gather evidence of student learning from their knowledge building work. And assessment in a knowledge building context should seek to, wherever possible, empower students to take ownership of their learning and identify their next learning steps. So I've pulled out an example of this from a recent assessment my students did. So they were reflecting back on their knowledge building and knowledge forum and what was helpful for them and what helped to develop their understanding. And I'm far from completely pulling everything that we do for assessment from their knowledge building, but we're taking steps towards that. And I'd be interested to hear what Darren's been doing in terms of assessment, because I know that he's been doing some really innovative stuff with his community.
Thank you.
Cool. So that is me, and I've spent way too much time talking about that.
Yeah. Thank you, Philippa. We only have time to have 1 or 2 questions, and then we need to have a more general discussion of the whole thing. Can we get back to the screen? Yeah. Questions?
Well, I've got a question. In terms of storing evidence, because I don't know the platform, so is there a place that students publish work?
The Knowledge Forum actually will allow collating information. It's basically a database which you can actually through them, then you can publish. Yeah.
We could show you it's before it ends, before the webinar ends, Angela. If you want to have actually see it.
Yeah.
It's pretty worthwhile.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? We only have like less than 15 minutes now. Can Darren, you go to the last question that we need to actually address. What do you see about the future of knowledge buildings in New Zealand? What's the work that we can do in the future? Particularly, what's the work we can do which can be facilitated by NET through NEX? Because we have like 21 people here already. If they are interested in doing more work in knowledge building, we can always form a group, or we can actually direct all these people to the next whatever. Do you have any suggestions that what we should do? Because I'm sure that we need some follow-on activities after this workshop, right? We can't just finish here.
Well, it depends if anyone's got any general questions now in terms of not even considering, you know, future discussion of where we go from here, but if you want any further clarification or to see anything, would be good.
Yeah, we still have a bit of time.
Because we've got a mix of people. We've got some people who are experienced with it and some who are entirely new.
Yeah.
Has anyone got any sort of anything they'd like to do, go through, talk about?
No question.
I'd like to ask about when you ask focus questions to kids, that seems to be not lined up with knowledge building. Am I right in that impression? Does that make sense?
Would anyone want to answer this question?
It also goes to the, you know, some of those things that Philippa was alluding to about the role of the teacher in building a knowledge building community with your classes. It is worthwhile spending time modelling the discursive practices, the approaches to debate and discussion that students need to build confidence in doing so that they can be knowledge builders together. And in that space, you may be modelling what good questions look like and then leaving room for them to create their own. But this is where that need for teacher facilitation comes in at the start as you're creating that. And when you first launch into Knowledge Forum with students, for example, you are probably going to have to throw out some big open-ended questions to get students started, but then it's the challenge, you know, is to stay out of that discussion as a teacher, and sometimes that means letting the silence happen for a while as well, so that students eventually, you know, feel that imperative to someone always steps up to the plate to keep it running, if you like.
I think the role of the teacher is really interesting one. Sorry, Chris, really, and I'd love for Madeline to have we just share what she used to do. But there's the you know, the sage and stage sort of thing. We've got the guide on the side sort of thing, and I can't remember where this came from. Now it's quite a few years ago with a university professor in Australia did this paper. It was really interesting, sort of and one thing she talked about is the meddler in the middle, the concept of the teacher actually being a part of the whole process, so rather than being seen as the expert. So I personally quite like, and I'm not saying it's the right way of doing it, it's just one thing to consider is actually participating with the students. So it's quite a good way of modeling the process with them, but also actually engaging in the learning yourself, especially if you're not an expert in the area. So that's sort of quite interesting. But Madeline used to, where have you gone, Madeline? There you go. I quite liked how you approached the teacher role.
Well, it's a few years back now, but Philippa's art history class used to be my art history class way back, and I started trying to figure this out. And NCEA Level 3 art history is content saturated, highly demanding in terms of NCEA and the exams and whatnot. So I had to figure out how the heck to give students an authentic learning experience that they led, yet the evidence that dropped out of that, the ideas that they developed, still dovetailed with what was needed. So I played around with challenging the students straight away around their roles by asking them to see themselves as art historians and curators. And that enabled me to sort of step back into a different type of role. And I spent quite a bit of time coming up with really rich starter questions. And that was something that we talked about as the whole community. So it wasn't me doing that in isolation. The students understood and accepted that process as well. Yeah, so we'd have these rich questions that would kick them off into discussion. And one of the most beautiful moments was when a student actually reshaped the question within the community for the community. So it still worked beautifully, but that level of agency was pretty exciting to see. So yeah, really being quite explicit with talking to the students around the roles of teachers and the roles of learners was really important. And also, it's just gone straight out of my head. I had a good idea, but it's gone. Oh, Philippa said something about, Mark, about creating silence, so students have to step in. So one of those principles is about collective cognitive responsibility. And I had students sending me emails as I was teaching online, being a bit stressed, saying, I haven't contributed anything, and I know that that's really important. So I was able to help guide them as to how to engage, but that also told me that they felt that sense of responsibility and contribution. So that's something I used to do.
Sorry, Chris, you're going to answer something then, or comment?
Yeah, I was just going to share something that's kind of practical from today, actually. So I'm in the Bay of Plenty at the moment. I'm a critical friend for a teacher-led innovation fund project with 4 schools up here that are exploring knowledge building. And one of the strategies I saw a teacher employ today, which I thought was quite neat, was so the knowledge building kind of the provocation, the big question is, what will happen if the internet turns off tonight, 12 o'clock, midnight, forever? And this is with a group of 5/6s, year 5/6s. And what sort of came from that was that the students basically had all kinds of ideas as to what would happen. That basically, so there was almost ambiguity within ambiguity. So the main question itself was sufficiently ambiguous to kind of have loads of big grey areas and loads of opportunity for discussion and debate, and no definitive, necessary, correct answer that you can Google or land upon. But what's also come out of it is that all the claims that the students made. So we've been using this futures thinking framework called the futures wheel as a thinking tool for this, where they basically say, well, what would the first order consequences of this event be, and the second order consequences, and so on. And what's ended up happening is they've come up with a list of sort of 9 possible first order consequences. There are things like phones won't work and things like that. And those claims that have been then made have now sort of, they've basically taken their own wings. And the teacher's already now planning for subsequent lessons over the next week, where the students will then start to explore the claims that have been made within the community to kind of come to some sense around this big question that ultimately is really ambiguous and can't be answered definitively, but students can kind of have a sort of a messy answer to this complex uncertain problem. So I kind of like that idea of sort of using questions in a way that provokes smaller questions that can kind of contribute to it. So it all sort of sews itself together, really. Also, just to sort of jump onto what Madeline was saying. So my kind of gateway drug for me for knowledge building was the nature of science, which is kind of like this holy grail of science education that's been there for like 30, 40 years and no one's ever really been able to kind of successfully achieve, which is ultimately getting kids to think like scientists. So I completely agree with the idea of using knowledge building as a way to sort of allow kids to work within a disciplinary framework. And I think it can provide a really solid way of using a skills kind of focused approach to actually embed disciplinary thinking. And I think it's a missing component in the knowledge skills debate, in my opinion. So yeah, that's all I've got to add.
Thank you, Chris. We don't really have much time. We only have 3 minutes left. Darren, should we go back to your question?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, the question basically is where to next? I emailed a few people some time ago with I think probably good intent in terms of having some ongoing discussions, and then that intent sort of got swamped by other priorities, which I find quite annoying. But it's sort of knowledge building to me, many of the people here has too much worth to not promote, somehow to not further interrogate and to follow up. And so it'll be probably worth considering now where to next. And there are people who perhaps would be interested in following up and looking further. So how do we do that? How do we actually get some momentum in this? So it's not something that just, it's pockets of people perhaps picking it up here or there. Any thoughts or any requests even?
Are you interested in, I'm asking for the group, are you interested in doing more work on knowledge building, like meaning, do you want to know more about it and want to practice it in your classroom? Are you interested in engage in some sort of online discussion, further discussion of it, or for us to provide more resources in different aspects of it?
I find it really helpful. I don't know what the divvy up of age groups for students, but I find it really helpful just when you're talking, Chris, just to get snippets of actually what is happening in the classroom, and it sort of helps you put some of that pedagogical ideas into a context, and I find that quite helpful to gauge on how I could approach it in my own learning. And I think that there is quite a big difference between primary age students and high school students and what you can achieve just looking over those principles. Some of them seem quite difficult to apply to a younger audience. So I don't know if conversations could maybe...
Most of the studies in other countries, they were conducted in primary schools, actually.
All of the work
in secondary.
Plenty is primary based.
Yeah, and in a variety of subjects, not just science, but humanities, history, art history, every subject almost. And even in kindy, their studies actually been done in kindergarten, which have been successful.
Yeah, exploring some of those contexts I think would be really useful.
Yeah. And that means knowledge building can be done for any age group, not just like secondary or senior secondary.
Yeah.
One of the things we've been doing is developing a library of experiences for the teachers that are participating in our programs, which basically are kind of context or big questions that are kind of ambiguous enough to invite discussion. And just to kind of give one practical example of a primary thing, we recently had teachers using ambiguous pieces of artwork where the meaning was difficult to define and there was multiple perspectives that could be drawn. And literally it was used as a provocation in a group of kids that were year 4, I think was the room I was in, where they were asked what's going on in the picture. And there was all kinds of assumptions that the kids drew that could then be challenged in an open forum. Like there was a male character in the picture and they were like, oh, that's that girl's dad. And there was all kinds of other things. Well, maybe it's not a dad. And it was just it wasn't necessarily kind of this opportunity to build like a concrete sort of piece of knowledge, but it was just to sort of open up minds to the fact that there's different perspectives about things. So, I mean, that's just kind of one little piece. It wasn't STEM related. A lot of our stuff originally was STEM related, but now it's moved into like Wings said, arts, literacy, and then more recently, lots of stuff around futures thinking.
Can I suggest, we need to actually conclude very soon because we are 1 minute over time. Can I suggest that do you actually have Darren's email address or my email address or our research group, whatever?
What I'll do, Wing, is I'll follow. We've got access to all the email addresses. We'll follow up with an email and just to find out what other further support or follow-up people want. I wondered. I think really another webinar would be really useful. Don't call it a webinar. Another discussion, korero or workshop, whatever you want to call it. Just actually, so would people be keen on that? Actually, just meeting again at some stage, and we can continue to try and pull people in. I think that'll be. We can put it out there if people are not interested. I'd love to. I've always had an interest in forming an active community of practice on this, on an online sort of almost national network. These things take time, of course, and resources are the other thing. But you know, I'd love to be able to do that. Actually, pull people together in this sort of common interest. And sorry, I'm trying to look at the chat at the same time, which has got stuff going on. Yeah, and something we've done in the past is actually we've engaged people. We've put out as an event a knowledge building event where people can actually actively participate in knowledge building themselves. So we present, you know, or we can actually, the group themselves can actually present some problems that are educational, whatever they may be, and actually actively sort of get involved and do some knowledge building ourselves. And you almost sort of set it as a 2-week thing and say, right, it's going to be then, come and get involved, register, etc. That might be something we could do as well.
We can. I'm sure. I'm interested in supporting any teachers and working with any teachers and in the classes and providing you with resources. I'm more than happy to be engaged. So, and we will continue to develop. There's a publication around this, and we'll keep putting stuff on. Like, I will, and I'm sure Philippa can do this as well. Like, just do a wee screencast of our you know, what we've been doing with our students, and so you can actually see some examples. Like my philosophy course, my senior philosophy course, is probably the best instances of knowledge building I've ever seen. There's plenty of kids on the periphery, but there's been some really, really good stuff. Just part, I think, because of the nature of the subject, attracts sort of kids who tend to think outside the box. So more than willing to share some of those. That would be good.
One real quick thing I'd like to see as well from this is there has been some talk about knowledge forum and then also some talk about primary groups, and I find that knowledge forum's a little bit of a leap for some of those guys, and as Wing alluded to earlier on, is like kind of strategies to sort of support knowledge building discourse. I think we could get a lot from each other from that. I know that's been a big focus here. I'd certainly be keen to get people that I'm working with sharing community.
Good, yeah, sure. Chris will think about this, and we'll keep talking. And I'm sure there will be follow-on activities, and then I'm sure that everyone will be contacted, and we'll have our ideas, we'll build on our ideas, we'll critique our ideas, and we are already a knowledge building community.
Yeah, we will actually invite everyone to a space of some kind. So if you're interested, there's.
Well, thank you very much. Our time is over time. Thank you for attending this workshop, your contribution, your ideas, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.